Good evening, you're watching Reality Check. Till about a year back, Arvind Subramanian was the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Someone who spearheaded efforts to promote growth, something measurable by GDP. Now though, in the United States where he lives, Mr. Subramanian says that the GDP growth numbers, which have hovered at about 7%, are all wrong, and that the real growth numbers are at 4.5% in his calculation over the last several years. Now, he does not ascribe any political motives for the bump in GDP numbers, but says that they were done by UPA To government technocrats who got it all wrong, he says. So what does this new study mean for the India growth story? That's our first debate this evening. But also on the program tonight, Praful Patel, the NCP leader, who was once Civil Aviation Minister, is being questioned by the Enforcement Directorate for his role in the merger of Indian Airlines and Air India back in 2007. The Enforcement Directorate also says Mr. Patel had links to a lobbyist who paid him off to secure favourable routes to Gulf-based airlines. But first, let's talk about what Arvind Subramanian, the former Chief Economic Advisor to the government till just about a year back, says about the India growth story. He says that contrary to reports that the GDP had been growing at about 7%, the actual growth, he believes, is just about 4.5%. And the impact of this can be felt in several sectors.
A stunning report by the ex-Chief Economic Advisor that India has been growing far slower than the government has reported. Arvind Subramanian, in a detailed paper, says that the actual growth is 4.5%, not 7% for the 5 years from 2011-12 to 2016-17. While the government has officially refused to comment, a top India industry representative says there are growth challenges.
हम तो देखना चाहेंगे इस मुद्दे में कि ग्रोथ का जो कैसे ग्रोथ को बढ़ाएं. डेफिनेटली आई हैव जस्ट सीन अब जो अरविंद सुब्रमण्यम जी का कमेंट, तो अभी कैसे इन्वेस्टमेंट को ले आ सकते हैं, कैसे एम्प्लॉयमेंट को एनहांस कर सकते हैं, उसको कैसे इम्प्लीमेंट कर सकते हैं, वही मेजर मुद्दा हमारे पास अभी है.
Subramanian defends his study, saying that it is a robust result, not depending on samples, indicators or estimation procedures. Soon after coming to power in 2014, the Modi government changed the methodology to calculate growth. What Subramanian has done now is to compare the new series with the old series, taking into account factors such as airline tickets and import-exports, and then comparing it to the trend in over 70 countries. This led to his conclusion that the new series has overestimated growth by 2.5%, plus minus 1%. While in the new series, growth was a spectacular 8.2% in the year Prime Minister Modi demonetized most of India's cash. Subramanian makes it clear that the puzzling upward revisions for recent years have been done by technocrats, not politicians. But several have questioned why he didn't speak out earlier when he was in the government. He says it's because it's only after leaving did he find time for such intensive research. Incidentally, Subramanian had raised doubts over the new method of calculating the GDP just months after it was launched.
The really puzzling number was for 2013-14,
yes,
which saw a huge
4.7 to 6.9.
Yeah, exactly.
That's almost a 50% increase in growth.
And at a time when 13-14 was our crisis year.
Yeah.
So that number is what I've called a puzzle, and I think many people are trying to still understand that 7.4. Sorry, for 2014-15 should be interpreted with caution because it doesn't gel or it's not completely reconcilable with
the real situation.
With everything else that's going in the economy.
Because of the budget preparation, the access to the finance ministry has been closed for many. At Arvind Subramanian's slow rate of growth, India may not be the fastest growing economy in the world, a tagline used frequently by both the government and the party. In finance ministry, this is Himanshu Shekhar for NDTV.
Well, striking numbers that, and at one level it raises so many question marks about what this government has been saying now for so long, that there is robust growth on any statistic, particularly GDP growth. It's been at 8% at times, it's been at about 7%, but Arvind Subramanian, till recently the Chief Economic Advisor, says no, it's 2% or more of that. What we're going to do in this in this first part of our program is, before I introduce our guests, just explain to you that we are going to be looking at the real picture, according to Arvind Subramanian, in a 35-page study, how or whether there were political motives at all which were involved, and the way forward, according to him, so that India gets a realistic idea of what the real numbers are. Joining us to look at all of this, Pooja Mehra, senior economic journalist, Madan Sabnavis, the chief economist of CARE Ratings, Professor Arun Kumar, a senior economist, and Lalita Kumara Mangalam, the director, India Foundation, and also BJP leader. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. The first one, the real picture, the GDP number mystery. Let's bring up that graphic. Now, according to Dr. Subramanian, there were 17 indicators that he looked at from 2001 to 2018, and he examined these to arrive at a more realistic set of numbers. There was a mismeasurement of the formal manufacturing sector, which resulted also in faulty GDP numbers. Weak job growth and the financial sector stress may be directly linked to modest GDP growth. This is a big one because there has been so much that's been said about jobless growth in our country. There's been so much which has been spoken about financial sector stress. He says that if this is happening, it could be a link of these GDP numbers, which are far less than what we thought earlier on. And he says that credit, exports, imports and electricity must also be examined to arrive at a realistic GDP number. Lalita Kumara Mangalam, to you first. Does this basically mean that the India growth story doesn't exist? Ms. Kumara Mangalam, can you hear me? We've lost her line. Let me go across to Madan Sabnavis, the chief economist at CARE Ratings. Mr. Sabnavis, same question to you. Does this essentially mean that the India growth story, which has been described by this government, doesn't effectively exist?
No, actually, the way I look at what Mr. Arvind Subramanian has come out with is more of an academic exercise which he has done. And while I've not had the privilege of reading the 35 pages, but I've read his article which has appeared in Indian Express. And when he uses 17 indicators, to my mind, I think it's a very academic exercise which is being done, whereas the CSO does something which is more at the ground level. The sectors which Mr. Subramanian looked at are the organized sector, whereas we should remember around 40 to 50% of our economy is in the unorganized sector, for which the CSO actually has certain rules, certain proxies which are used. So while I do not subscribe to the CSO numbers of 8.2% during demonetization, there are definitely problems out there. But I think carrying it to 4.5% is also probably at the other extreme. I would not go along with that. Though I would, of course, admit that because economists have the privilege that whenever you come up with any model, you have certain assumptions which you draw out, and then you create a model, and then you say that all the numbers fit in well, and therefore you're getting a certain conclusion, and nobody can really question that. But I think I would question the assumption of using only these 17 sectors.
He's using a few more, but I'll come to that in a moment. Do we have Lalita Kumara Mangalam back? Okay, we don't have her. Let me just go across to Professor Arun Kumar. Professor Kumar, among the points that he's mentioned, let me quote, the narrative of a guns-blazing India may have to cede to a more realistic one, is one of the key points. He says the GDP growth was bumped up in the last year of the UPA To government, is what he says. Now, this is also interesting, but in terms of the new numbers at 4.5%, which he says is a lot more realistic, what are your thoughts?
What has been done by Mr. Subramanian is to look at the period post the new GDP series that has come.
Yes.
And he has raised doubts about the new GDP series. Now, the new GDP series has seen several controversies where the rates of growth have been revised several times for political reasons. And the reason why they can be revised is because all GDP series are based on certain assumptions. And you can choose your assumptions to actually tweak the rate of growth. And that's what has been done. That, after the back series showed that the UPA growth was faster than the NDA growth, then, it was changed by changing the assumptions about the services sector, changing the assumptions about the inflation rate. Now what Mr. Subramanian has done is to create a further controversy by saying, I will look at an alternate methodology to see how the growth has been. And that's why he's used these 17 indicators plus made a comparison across 70 countries. And using these two factors, he's saying that the rate of growth was less by 2.5% over the entire series, you know. Now, I think we need to look at this methodology more carefully, because Indian economy is very different from the other international economies, because we have a very large unorganized sector, and that unorganized sector has to be taken into account. And unfortunately, in our GDP series, that is not taken into account carefully enough. When we take that into account, then the rate of growth would turn out to be different. Second is that, as you said, that the manufacturing sector rate of growth has come down because, you know, the index of industrial production is not matching the rate of growth being shown by the new series.
Okay.
So,
but let me just, Professor Kumar, if you just hold on for half a second, let me just go back to Lalitha Kumaramangalam, who joins us now. We've got that line up. Ma'am, till 1 year back, Arvind Subramanian was your chief economic advisor. He's retired now, and he says that, look, I've had time to look at the GDP numbers, and I believe these GDP numbers were inaccurate. This is a peer-reviewed study which he's done. It's 35 pages long. Doesn't this question the basis of the India growth story?
Vishnu, first of all, I find it quite ironic that he was in a particular job where he had access to every single economic data this country had produced over the last 70 years, not just the few years that he was there, and that this anomaly or this difference in the growth that he says the government claimed actually took place and what he says did not take place, did not occur to him, and he didn't examine it before that. It was his job as a chief economic advisor to tell the government certain things, including things like this. Now, with regard
but
to
ma'am, let me just interrupt you there.
Employment, economic growth, etc., there's been a controversy around it for some time. So,
Mrs. Kumaramangalam, just that one point that you're mentioning, he actually refers to it.
Dependent on unorganized labor and
unorganized one second, Mrs. Kumaramangalam, he refers to why he needed to actually spend time outside the position that he held to get this data. And let me quote from his article: the time and space afforded by being outside government were necessary to undertake months of very detailed research, including subjecting it to careful scrutiny and cross-checking by numerous colleagues to generate robust evidence. Not only does he stand by his analysis, he says, look, I'm going to release this data and let others comment on it. Let there be an international study at it. This was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. He knows what he's talking about. And he's backed it up, he says, in a 35-page document. Look, so how can we question him for what he's done? He's done it with all honesty. It's not as if he could have done it earlier, but he didn't do.
Can I reply?
Yes, ma'am.
No, I am not questioning Mr. Subramanian's motives. What I am saying is that there are various people over the world, different economists often have different criteria by which they come up with statistics, or even the statistics they may or may not include when it comes to GDP of a particular country.
Yes.
Indian GDP is quite, the Indian economy itself is much more convoluted and much less based on the organized sector as several other countries throughout the world. Now, I am not even calling into question Mr. Subramanian's credentials. I don't have the credentials to do that, quite honestly.
Okay.
But the fact is that it is a little strange that he couldn't, bring this to the notice of the government when he was their chief economic advisor.
To doing it is what he
now,
says, but I take your point,
whatever explanation he may have given, I haven't gone through the 37-page document, Vishnu. So I cannot comment in detail.
Okay,
but I do think that we also need to look at whatever document he has given, understand it, and look at it from the point of view of other economists who may have done their own work also.
Okay. Now, Pooja Mehra, let's just look at one of the key points, what he has done, because the basis on which he's reassessed GDP growth needs to be looked at. He's compiled 17 key indicators for the period between 2001 to 2017-18, and which are typically correlated with GDP growth: electricity consumption, two-wheeler sales, commercial vehicle sales, tractor sales, airline passenger traffic, foreign tourist arrivals, railway freight traffic, index of industrial production, index of industrial manufacturing, consumer goods, petroleum, cement, steel, and he believes that it's an analysis of all of this which takes into account both the organized and the unorganized sectors, which gives a realistic understanding of GDP growth. What's necessarily wrong in what he's saying?
What's basically wrong in what he's saying is that if GDP or national income accounts could be computed by running regression analysis and formulating a regression equation using two dummy variables, then around the world nobody would put in so much effort into creating national income account statistics, data collection and estimation frameworks, systems, devising indices, proxies where data does not exist, and revising these every 5 years. There is nobody in the world who estimates GDP in the manner in which Dr. Arvind Subramanian seeks to do it. The second mistake that he seems to make is that he first, if you read his paper, he first decides that there is an overestimation. He has not said why he has reached his conclusion that there is overestimation. Then he goes into estimating what is the magnitude of overestimation, and finally he tries to decide what is the source of this overestimation. I don't think that is the right sequence. Everybody agrees, the entire statistical community in India right now is grappling with some very grave technical difficulties, especially because of the MCA database. And nobody is saying that the MCA database or the GDP computation is free of problems. But at the same time, none of the statisticians have as yet reached any conclusion on whether the problems are resulting in overestimation, underestimation, or it's overestimation in some years and underestimation in other years. And if this is happening, it is happening to an extent which is statistically significant to distort GDP growth calculations and have policy implications. All of that analysis, all of India's statistical community is right now engaged in, and nobody's reached that conclusion yet. And yet Dr. Arvind Subramanian has decided that it is an overestimation.
He seems to have reinvented the wheel, is essentially what you're trying to argue over here. There is a reaction from the Indian Statistical Organization. We'll get that in a moment from now. But Mr. Sabnavis, one of the key points which I found fascinating was the point that he talks about weak job growth, financial sector stress, the fact that it does exist, it's been denied in the past. Jobless growth is something that we have spoken about in the past. The government has vociferously denied it. But he seems to indicate that weak job growth is a reality, financial sector stress is a reality during the time when he was Chief Economic Advisor, and that this is directly linked to modest GDP growth, 4.5% versus 7.5%. Is this correlation something that makes sense?
No, I think I would agree there, saying that there is definitely an employment issue. Jobs have not been created in a commensurate manner. But to say that the 7% is 4.5% because of the methodology which is used, and I think Pooja has explained it very well, and I fully agree with what she has said. I think that is where the error is there. We agree that jobs have not been created. We agree that there has been financial sector stress. The NPAs have been rising. The ratios, of course, have been sort of camouflage in case my denominator is much larger. We all agree that the GDP number of 7% may be on the higher side, which we're talking of. But to say that it comes down to 4.5% because of 17 sectors, which in fact all the variables which you have mentioned are already included in the GDP. You're talking of airline, freight, you're talking of cement, steel, electricity. That's already a part of my GDP calculation. So it looks like that you've taken out some elements of the GDP calculation and then use the regression to show that things are coming towards match the GDP growth rate, done the matching with the global thing, and then come to a conclusion that there is some overestimation in these 5-6 years. I think that's where I have a problem, saying that it's more of a desk job, it's an academic exercise, which cannot really capture what is happening.
But aren't academic exercises at the basis of determining economic growth numbers? You mentioned this one point, but isn't it essentially for economists and academics to decide the state of our economy? Isn't that how it should be decided?
No, the academic model is something which you run ex post, but the fact is when you're collecting data, you need to go to the ground level and see what exactly is happening. And when the CSA uses proxies, it's essentially proxies which have been put up in the open. You're saying there's an MCA database. I agree the MCA database does not.
Okay, Mr. Sabnavis, 1 second. I want to go across to my second graphic and go across to Professor Kumar, who also wants to make a point. Now, the other key sort of element in his article, and it's been reflected obviously in the document which he's written, is that he makes it very clear, I have no political motive to alter GDP numbers. Substantive work on GDP numbers which resulted in this bump, which he says should not have taken place, was done by technocrats under UPA 2. The GDP growth was bumped up in the last year of UPA 2. In fact, in an interview to NDTV quite some time back, he seemed to indicate the period in which this bump up had actually taken place. He says those technocrats had done it. So Lalita Kumar Mangalam, does that make this should not be looked at from a political standpoint, of one person, apparently saying something contrary to what he was doing when he was in government. He says, look, it's not the NDA, it happened earlier on.
Vishnu, I quite agree with what you said. I don't think it's the years that he's looking at, or I mean when he was or when he was not in government, whether it's UPA or NDA. The fact remains that I think there must be several explanations. I mean, if we go into much greater detail as to how he's actually done the study, etc., and what assumptions he has made, which may not be agreed to by a lot of other economists in India. I have no doubt Mr. Subramanian does not mean, does not bear any ill will, but the fact is that there has been quite a controversy over a lot of data that is being generated within India by economists in India itself, regardless of whether they are politically aligned to one government or one party or the other. So, the fact is that we need to look at it, perhaps not just focus on one man's claims, however excellent he may be at his job, but we need to take a look at what other economists are also saying, other statisticians. Yeah, we need to take not such a bird's eye view, but a much larger view of,
I'm sure he would argue, and he didn't come on this program tonight, that it wasn't really a bird's eye view.
We do not have problems in our economy.
Okay, one sec. Professor Arun Kumar, go ahead with the point you're making, sir. Go ahead.
Fine. But the thing is that nobody is saying,
what I want to say is that
in the economy. But to make such a drastic
statement, one second, Professor Kumar wants to come in. Professor Kumar, go ahead.
Well, I would say that it's not quite the most advisable thing to follow.
The base change that was brought about in 2011-12 was actually initiated by the UPA, and the data came out later, but there's a lot of controversy about it because of the missing companies in the MCA 21, because of which there's a blowing up factor. And now we know that there are missing companies. So in other words, the GDP calculation as per the new series has gone into one controversy after the other. That's why Mr. Subramanian has tried to look at an alternate methodology, and I think it's legitimate to look at alternate methodology where you look at the consumption of a variety of goods, and he's also suggesting that later on we can use GST data to try and do the consumption based measurement. So I think what he's pointing out is that if you look at alternate measures of GDP, then the GDP is lower by a certain percentage. The problem there is that Indian economy is different from the other international economies because our unorganized sector is very large, and therefore we need to look at the methodology that is used more carefully. But it's correct that we need to look at, because we cannot do the MCA 21 again. So therefore we have to look at alternate methodology to really look at this data.
Okay, I just want to, we've got a reaction coming in from the government. Let's just play that out. All right, I'm sorry, it's just a point. The government says comparison of old and new GDP series is not amenable. So basically disagreeing with what he's saying, the government says that GDP estimates are based on accepted procedures, and therefore they are, again, they're disagreeing with what Dr. Subramanian has had to say. Now, I want to move to the third set of points which he's spoken about. Let's bring up that graphic. The way forward. Now, he says urgent reform is required by recognizing that growth has been tepid, not torrid. India must restore growth as, can we have those graphics please? India must restore growth as a key policy objective, must restore reputational damage suffered to data generation, and methodology and implementation for GDP estimation must be revised by an independent task force. Pooja, what he's saying is that he stands by what he says, and he says that the method of analyzing GDP growth, the methodology and the process of implementation needs to be opened up to independent experts. So he's not saying that he's the final word. He says, if you don't believe me, you open it up internationally. Isn't that the way it should be done if there is a controversy?
I agree with that, and he's not the only one. Everybody's been saying this, that there are issues that need to be resolved, and this needs to be opened up to a wider range of experts. But the problem is that what he has done with his paper that he has released today is that he is conditioning the minds of the people, and the narrative now turns that India is overestimating GDP, whereas there is no technical grounds so far which is robust enough to make such a claim. Any independent researcher who's competent in statistics who would come up, say, with a conclusion which does not match this, stands to not gain acceptability in the public mind. And this, to my mind, is something that is avoidable. And, you know, Dr. Subramanian, given his stature, given that this is a paper that has been published by the Harvard University, one would expect a greater deal of caution in these kind of things from such reputed universities and such respected
Pooja, I would assume,
economists.
and you know, it's a peer-reviewed paper, and Harvard wouldn't publish anything, and you know, I mean, unless there was a basis to what he says. Anyhow, but that's a larger point. Professor Kumar, let me just ask you another key point over here, which has actually come up. Must restore reputational damage suffered to data generation. He believes that the basis of generating data in this country is flawed, and unless that is fixed, we don't get a real idea of what the truth is. Is there merit in what he's saying?
So, you know, there is merit because we have different frequencies of data coming in, and especially the unorganized sector data comes in with a great deal of time lag, and we make certain assumptions about the unorganized sector. Now, those assumptions change whenever there's a shock to the economy, and we've had several shocks to the economy in the recent period. So therefore, the ratios between the organized and the unorganized sector, the fact that the index of industrial production may not represent the unorganized sector, all these are factors that need to be factored into our estimation of GDP. And that's why I think he's right in saying that there are problems with our databases. We need a much faster, you know, database for the unorganized sector, and that the government is working at it. But until then, we need to depend on the employment generation and on the productivity data calculated in the reference year. Now, unfortunately, the employment data also the government says is not very reliable. So if the employment data is not reliable, then the GDP data will also not be reliable. So in other words, if we begin to say that our data has certain problems, then the data problems are not only in GDP, but they are also in our budget data, because the budget data depends on the GDP data. There are also problems with the RBI, because the RBI is doing inflation targeting, and it's also doing interest rate adjustment to induce growth. But if growth figures are wrong, then our RBI's targeting is also incorrect. In other words, if the GDP data is wrong because of the methodology, then there are a whole range of other problems vis-a-vis our data.
Okay, last couple of points over here. In his article, he writes, and I quote, "Growth estimates matter not just for reputational reasons, but critically for internal policy making." Would you agree, Mr. Sabnavis, that, you know, in our country, and it's not just true of this government or governments in the past, GDP growth was seen to be, you know, this one way of telling the world and perhaps trying to convince ourselves that, you know, we are getting there, we are really making progress, our problems are being resolved, and that we have quote unquote arrived. What he is trying to say is, don't do GDP numbers for reputation. You need these numbers for internal policy making. Isn't this profound sense? Because we get, you know, we tend to exaggerate these numbers as if it's all good.
No, actually, see, GDP is probably the only universal benchmark which is used across all countries. So I think GDP number needs to be sacrosanct, it needs to be correct. And I think the kind of controversy which we have had in the past, and I think he's only added to it, because we should remember that when he was chief economic advisor, I remember in one of the economic surveys, he kept talking about India being in a sweet spot. And he kept saying how India was much better than all the other countries. Now, when you suddenly have a chief economic advisor who now leaves and says that what he was saying was actually not right, and they were not doing the right thing, I think the credibility of the GDP data is going to be questioned further. It's also true that all our policies, as what was mentioned also by Professor, you talk of RBI policy, you're saying you're taking a call on interest rates, inflation based on the GDP growth number. Are we saying that we have been talking of all wrong GDP numbers right now? So I think it's a serious issue. Since this is the universal benchmark being used everywhere, it's the one which is used for all policy making. We have to make sure that the system is right and we get this number right.
All right, but I'd like to thank you one way or the other. It's a huge debate now. The former chief economic advisor to this government, a person of integrity and somebody who was very close to this government till just a year back, says the numbers on which the government worked, not just the NDA but the UPA prior to that, were all wrong. That is just 4.5% growth that we've realistically had. And he says that there are lots of reasons why he believes that is true. Will there be something more substantive in terms of a government response? We don't know at this juncture.